All right, enough blood sacrifices to the sun gods, Gen Z. Let's talk a little bit about spirituality and the meaning of life. The Aztecs are one of the most poorly understood civilizations in history, and I kind of feel the same way about Gen Z as a group. Right now, if you just Google Gen Z and then scroll over to the news tab, it's actually ludicrous. Literally every single day, there are hundreds of articles published by writers who are certainly not Gen Z, talking all about how Gen Z is destroying this or Gen Z is changing that. They all seem to miss the spirit of Gen Z, just like most modern history tends to boil the Aztecs down to feathery headdresses and apocalyptic prophecies and sacrifices. Now, I'm 29, which I believe technically makes me a zillennial, so I feel at least halfway qualified to make this video. And yes, I know my devious hairline makes me look older, but God made me so good at YouTube that he had to nerf me somehow, so there you go. Believe it or not, most of what you know about the Aztecs didn't actually come from the Aztecs themselves, it came from their Spanish conquerors. You can already see how there might be a little bit of a conflict of interest there. I mentioned those blood sacrifices to the gods earlier, and that's probably one of the first things that pops into your head when you hear the word Aztec, especially if you've seen the movie Apocalypto. Just imagine you're a Spanish conquistador visiting this grand Aztec city for the first time. Your mind is absolutely blown by the incredible architecture, the wide bustling streets, all the noises and colors and smells. In some ways, it feels similar to the European Catholic city you came from, and in other ways, it feels like you've landed on another planet. Now imagine you're soaking in all of this scenery when you hear a commotion and you look up to that big temple that looms over the city center. There's a priest with a flint knife, and there's a man stretched across a big stone block, and there's 4 other guys holding his arms and legs down. The Spanish were, of course, completely shocked at what they saw, and eyewitnesses like Bernal Diaz de Castillo and Diego Duran couldn't believe that a society capable of mass sacrifice on such a mind-boggling scale was otherwise remarkably dignified, decorous, and clean, to use their words. So you've got these completely confused Europeans trying to piece together this insane paradox at the heart of the Aztec worldview, but they weren't Aztec themselves, which meant that they were missing a lot of the context. You can see this now as all of these writers, or maybe they're not even writers, maybe they're just bots, try and piece together especially Gen Z spiritual trends. Maybe you've heard of the Gen Z religious revival that is supposedly happening right now, and we're gonna talk more about that in a bit, but I literally, for the sake of this video, Googled Gen Z religious, and look at these 2 headlines right next to each other. The first article says that Gen Z as a whole, men and women, are becoming more religious. The second one says women specifically are losing their religion. If you keep diving deeper into this religious revival among the youth, you keep seeing these 2 opposing views. You'll get a New York Times article talking all about how influencers in major cities are becoming Catholic and attracting other young people to Mass. And then there's an article right below it saying that for every 1 person that joins the Catholic Church, 12 leave. It's like trying to learn about Aztec spirituality from reading Spanish sources. It's just confusing, and I think it paints an incomplete picture. So first, let's dive a little deeper into what the Aztecs actually believed, their real worldview, because I think it can help us do the same for these dang Gen Zers. You see, the Aztecs believed that humans were born into a literal blood debt, which they called Nextlahualiztli. I sometimes will need a pronunciation guide for a few of these Nahuatl words. This was rooted in the idea that the gods, many, many moons ago, had sacrificed their own blood to create the human race, so blood was really important. It was like this form of spiritual payment. Sacrificing a living human being was the act of paying a debt to the gods to keep the world from ending. It had its own internal logic, no matter how barbaric it actually was. The Aztecs believed that they were living in the final age, the 5th sun. This current era that we're in now was called the Nextlahualiztli, or the 4 movement, and in Aztec iconography, movement is the sign for earthquakes. The 4 comes from the idea that the previous 4 worlds before this one had been destroyed by jaguars, wind, fire, and water. Out of those 4 options, being destroyed by jaguars sounds like it would be by far the most painful, but also the most metal. So if this world now is the 5th iteration, then chances are it's probably gonna end the same way the other 4 did, suddenly and violently. I see in my comment section all the time, and I hear from people younger than me, this real sense that the world is ending like imminently. Either it'll be World War III that causes it, or climate change, or more recently, some sort of AI apocalypse where ChatGPT finally gets revenge on you for not being polite enough in your prompts. There was the world that came before, which was the world of our parents, and seemingly that one was pretty nice. It's like when Tony Soprano said, "Do you ever feel like you came in at the tail end of something great?" I won't subject you to my Tony Soprano impression. There's this environmental debt and economic debt and social debt that it feels like our parents and our grandparents racked up, and they took all the benefits, and now we're left holding the bag. Now it's all about sacrifice. Gen Z are the ones who feel tasked with the sacrifice of their lifestyles or their futures to pay off this world-saving debt that they had absolutely no hand in creating. Just look at the job market. I feel like the typical path now is to graduate with a degree and apply for jobs you're not quite qualified for, get rejected, apply for jobs you actually are qualified for, get rejected, apply for jobs you're overqualified for, also get rejected, and then end up taking whatever you can get. Sometimes that even means starting a YouTube channel about medieval history. For the Aztecs, this meant that everything in this world became imbued with a deeper spiritual meaning because all of it was part of this grand story of continually paying back the debt. When your whole life becomes about sacrifice and keeping the universal scales balanced so everything doesn't completely fall apart, it creates this really unique psychological paradigm. Speaking of that feeling of being tasked with a world-saving debt, it is incredibly easy to get trapped in an all-or-nothing mindset. I've definitely felt that pressure in my own life where I believed if I wasn't making some massive, perfect impact, I was somehow failing. I realized I was holding back on new goals because I was sure I'd be bad at them, and that pressure kept me stuck. For me, that was trying to restart a consistent running routine after I took a long break. I found myself so paralyzed by the need for a perfect run that I'd spend like 20 minutes overanalyzing my old training data instead of just putting on my shoes and heading out. Today's sponsor, BetterHelp, has been a huge part of helping me navigate those realizations. I believe that taking one small, imperfect step creates more momentum than waiting for perfection, and therapy provides the support to see that. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. You take a brief quiz and get matched with a licensed therapist quickly. You can communicate however you feel comfortable, so that means phone, video, or text. If it's not the right fit, you can switch therapists anytime at no extra cost. Over 6 million people have used them so far. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/medievalmindset for 10% off your first month. Most of those who ended up on the altars of these great Aztec temples were prisoners who had been captured during raids, but not all of them. Every year, there was a festival called Toxcatl, which took place in the spring at the end of the dry season. For a full year leading up to the festival, a man or a woman known as an Ixiptlatl would roam around the city. He or she was basically allowed to have and do anything he wanted or she wanted. Nobody could refuse their requests. They were treated like celebrities. Some of them even had servants and multiple spouses. So far, it sounds pretty good, but just like everything in this cruel world we live in, there was a catch. Ixiptlatl meant impersonator, and they were meant to be the physical avatar of a specific god. For a set period of time, this human being was essentially standing in for the divine figure of, let's say, Tezcatlipoca, just to name an Aztec god off the top of my head. Remember earlier when I was talking about sacrifice and blood debt and all that? Well, a human's blood was obviously worthy and useful for sacrifice, but what if you could get the blood of a god? Wouldn't that be just grand? So that's what the Ixiptla did. They stood in for the gods and were sacrificed as living embodiments of the gods, making their sacrifice more worthwhile. As if that wasn't enough, all of the surviving evidence seems to suggest that, in most cases, they went willingly to their deaths. In fact, on the day that they were scheduled to die, they would ascend the temple steps themselves and choose the exact moment of their death. Now, it's important to note that if they were scared or coerced, that wouldn't have been recorded. The mestizo grandson of the Aztec ruler Nextlahualiztli, the mestizo great-grandson of the Aztec ruler Nextlahualiztli wrote much later, "It was never found out whether any one of those that were chosen for this sacrifice had fled, for to flee seemed a thing unworthy of men that represented such great majesty as this idol, so as not to be held as cowardly and fearful with perpetual infamy, not only in this land, but also in his own. And so they wished first to die, to earn eternal fame, because they held this to be a happy and glorious end." Now, trying to examine all of this 500 years later, it can be difficult to tell whether or not having your heart carved out on a sacrificial stone was really a glorious and happy end, but there was obviously a wider spiritual context here with the whole impersonating a god thing, having a year of fame and fortune before you died, yada yada yada. What's important for us is that it seems like, at least on some level, the Ixiptla opted into this. They did so because their whole worldview made it seem like the correct and honorable thing to do. If you've inherited this crumbling, decaying world, that has apparently already been deleted and refreshed 4 times, and you get the opportunity to give yourself over to postpone the 5th deletion and also gain eternal glory, maybe it doesn't sound so bad. Plus you get that year of fame, comes with unlimited ladies, any kind of food you can think of, an army of servants. I'm just saying that people have done a lot more for a lot less. Now, in previous videos, I've talked about how Gen Z was the first generation to grow up with the internet as this all-seeing eye in a world where the lines between the digital and the physical get more blurry every day. Because of this, they've become extremely self-aware and self-conscious because they never know who could be filming them and posting them to an audience of millions on TikTok or Instagram Reels. There have been so many think pieces coming out this year about why Gen Z is statistically consuming less alcohol than previous generations, and I think that this fear of being seen is a big part of it. But lately, I've noticed something kind of interesting when I'm scrolling Reels at night, which is that these youngins are sick of this whole paradigm, so they're actively rebelling against it. They are purposely filming themselves doing the most cringeworthy and embarrassing things they can think of simply because they don't want to hide anymore. And then you scroll to the comments and they all say the same thing. Imagine if a recruiter sees this, or bro's digital footprint is devious, or something like that. But in the end, it's a form of sacrifice. That sounds like a familiar equation where they're giving up their futures for about a year of fortune and fame. But just like with the Ixiptla, I think there's an important question of consent and also psychology to examine here. Just look at someone like Haley Welch, who you probably know better as the Hawk Tuah girl.
And spit on that thing.
That whole viral moment came from a clip where she was just some random woman drunk in Nashville, and a guy with a camera stuck a microphone in her face and asked her a question. Her response was funny and memorable, so the video exploded and the rest is history. But when Haley was stumbling around Nashville that fateful night, and when she answered that question, was she really consenting to everything that came after? And then the whole thing got so big that it was like she had no choice but to opt in and move to LA and try to make the influencer thing work, which of course crashed and burned when they tried to do this meme coin pump and dump scheme and got caught. I can't believe I just used the phrase meme coin pump and dump scheme in one of my videos, but there you go. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just Google Haley Welch meme coin. It's actually an interesting story. But anyway, now she's returned to relative obscurity, but for the rest of her life, she will be known as the Hawk Tuah girl, immortalized as the Hawk Tuah girl, I should say. In return, she got maybe a year of fame and fortune in Los Angeles before she was figuratively sacrificed on the altar for our amusement. I don't really see a lot of people talking about this part of the whole going viral thing, which is the inevitable downfall that comes after, but I think most of us are aware that it's part of the package. You get your 15 minutes, and if you're lucky, maybe you can spin it into a career as a YouTuber or podcaster, but most really aren't able to do that. Even still, there are tons of young people every day who are willing to take this crappy deal because anything seems better than the world they currently inhabit. Might as well sacrifice yourself on the altar of the algorithm and get something out of all this nonsense, because maybe it's better to be the Hawk Tuah girl for the rest of your life than to just be nobody. At least that's how social media can make it seem, and that's certainly how the prospect of being an Ixiptlatl must have come across to a young person wandering the streets of Tenochtitlan 5 centuries ago. We've established by now that the Aztec mindset did definitely have a doomer vibe to it that actually seems more familiar the more I think about it. But what I'm interested in is, what did this all mean for their day-to-day lives? Like, how did they respond to this? In Aztec philosophy, there was this constant quest for worthiness. The world itself was viewed as fundamentally unstable and slippery, which makes sense because, as we just learned, there had been 4 apocalypses already. There was a special class of wise men called the Tlamatinime, who from now on I'll just call the T-boys, and their whole job was basically to spend their days finding the truth about human life and figuring out how to stay rooted in such a precarious world. It's worth talking about these wise men for a moment because their philosophy was almost totally erased by the Spanish. Their name literally means knowers of things in the Aztec language, Nahuatl, and the reason their philosophy is fascinating is because it developed in complete isolation from Pythagoreanism in Greece or Confucianism in China, or basically any other philosophy of the old world. The whole Aztec philosophical tradition stemmed from an obsession with one central problem: the impermanence of life. You see, the Aztecs were absolutely obsessed with mortality. It sort of reminds me of the whole memento mori obsession that sprang up in Western Europe after the ravages of the Black Death. Remember that you too must die, and keep your death in mind at all times. A lot of this still survives in Mexican culture today, like the annual death celebrations, also known as the Dia de los Muertos. I'll quote here a poem by a T-boy named Nextlahualiztli, who was also the great-grandfather of that mestizo guy I quoted earlier, the one who wrote about the Ixiptla, so that's a cool little connection. Please be sure to subscribe out of pure respect that I'm tackling all of these Nahuatl words so effortlessly. So here's the quote. I, Nextlahualiztli, ask this, do we truly live on Earth? Not forever here, only a little while. Even the jade breaks, golden things fall apart, precious feathers fade. Not forever on Earth, only a moment here. Okay, so the obvious follow-up question to all of this is, if existence is transient and nothing lasts forever, then what actually is enduring and true? Well, their answer actually sounds pretty familiar. One of the central aspects of the Aztec's conception of the universe is Tlamacehualiztli, which means spirit or God in the Nahuatl language. This is an unending divine life force that simultaneously moves beyond and moves through all of existence. So the only answer to life's biggest existential question is believing in the hidden unity of the universe and believing in something much larger than your fleeting life. What this meant on a day-to-day basis is that the Aztecs saw existence as fundamentally precarious. The Codex Mendoza is this incredible chronicle of Aztec society, but it was written by Spanish observers, so keep that in mind. But in the Codex, a father is quoted as saying to his son, "The earth is not a good place. It is a place of joyless fatigue, of labor. It is a place of the slippery path." Now, that might sound kind of weird or dark to our modern ears, but it doesn't seem like the reaction was hopelessness. Instead, this worldview meant embracing extreme discipline. If the path is super slippery, the individual has a yoke of the terror of time and an awesome responsibility to remain upright and worthy of history, to quote the scholar Herbert Burhan, who wrote extensively on Aztec spirituality. Now, there are some key phrases that I just mentioned that I want to make sure we keep top of mind. The first is slippery path, and the second is joyless fatigue. The Aztecs believed that true freedom came from being strong of heart and deeply rooted in the Tlamacehualiztli, the great life force of the universe. They rejected reckless hedonism, making the unanimous cultural decision that it was at best reserved for children and at worst for the lowest degenerates. This idea is obviously being batted around in the culture right now with the aforementioned Gen Z religious revival, specifically the revival of traditional religion, meaning Catholicism or Orthodoxy generally. The number of baptisms at Easter this year in the Catholic Church was the highest in decades, and there's definitely some social media hype centered around the rise of influencers in New York posting about going to Mass. It's been interesting to see the reaction to these articles that are coming out of these major outlets about the so-called revival. The authors are clearly skeptical, and you can just feel from reading what they wrote that for some reason they would prefer it if this revival didn't happen at all. I think a lot of older people or wealthier people are completely out of touch with what Gen Z is going through, and so they don't really understand what could be driving a movement like this. They say, why don't you kids just chase reckless hedonism and live lives of quiet desperation like we did? What, are you too good for that? Apparently the youth have done some soul searching and they've realized that getting drunk in the same bar every weekend with the same people you've been getting drunk with for your entire life can't possibly be all there is to this reality. Like the Aztecs, they're looking around at this world that seems to be completely crumbling apart, and instead of saying, screw it, let's just do whatever we want, they're actually looking for deeper meaning. But I think this concept goes even wider, and it doesn't even necessarily have to do with Gen Z embracing Christianity specifically. You can see the rejection of hedonism among Gen Z with the reaction to the new season of Euphoria that just came out. Obviously, the show was super popular during the COVID years, and it's always played pretty fast and loose with what's appropriate for television and how much you can sexualize characters that are supposed to be teenagers. But apparently this season has really jumped the shark, and even the most morally flexible on social media are reacting with disgust to some of the more demeaning scenes. It almost kind of feels like this collective cultural and spiritual moment where we're drawing a line in the sand and saying enough is enough. You don't have to demean yourself like this. We have some moral values that we all hold. Being human actually means something, and dignity is part of that definition. We don't want to watch dignity be stripped away anymore. But let's keep getting a little Aztec with this, because in the end, it's all about the history on this channel. To the Aztecs, your body wasn't just yours, because it was also a cosmic battery that had to be kept at full charge. Why did it have to be kept at full charge? Because that was part of what prevented the world from ending. All of this tied into a sense of individual and group responsibility for staving off that fifth apocalypse. You think of the ancient Greeks or the ancient Romans, and maybe you think togas and whatever, but you also think wild, wine-drenched orgies out under the Mediterranean stars, or maybe that's just me. There's this kind of idea we have that all ancient cultures were wild in this way, but the Aztecs actually weren't. Public drunkenness was a capital offense for young people. The most popular form of alcohol was pulque, which is still made and consumed today. It's made from the fermented sap of the agave plant, and I've never tried it, but it actually looks pretty tasty. Pulque was seen as a sacred drink, and it was strictly reserved for the elderly or for specific religious rituals. Also, just a quick plug, merch is now available at medievalmindset.com. You can get a super cool t-shirt with this sick Charlemagne design on the back, 9 different colors, 100% ring spun cotton, doesn't shrink in the wash, and you can rep our medieval movement of seeking truth and beauty in everyday life. We also have hats and mugs in different colors, and you get 10% off all merch with code MINDSET. If you're hungry for more Medieval Mindset content, sign up for the Patreon. You can get access to the weekly podcast, exclusive videos, the book club, weekly essays written by me on all sorts of medieval topics, and more. So sign up now and get your merch at medievalmindset.com. Back to the video. But John, why was that, you ask? Because getting completely smashed was seen as losing your face. It made you slippery in an already slippery world, and it disconnected you from your tonali. What exactly the tonali was is difficult to explain, and we don't really have one word that lines up with it. Maybe it's worth an entire video in and of itself, but basically it was sort of like your soul, but also your life force that was breathed into you as a fetus by various deities. According to the scholar David Carrasco, the tonali was believed to provide vigor and energy for growth and development. So if you drank too much, you were basically severing your connection to this beautiful force. So the decline in drinking we're seeing now is definitely about avoiding hangovers. It is, like I said, about not doing embarrassing stuff when you're drunk. It's a vibe thing too, though. Every day, more and more research comes out about how bad alcohol is for you, especially for your mental health, which Gen Z is more tapped into than any other generation. Booze is a depressant, so it messes with your mind and it dulls your frequency. The whole sober curious movement, to me, is really just this Aztec idea of treating temperance as a way to stay rooted in a world that is already chaotic enough. In the youth schools of the Aztec Empire, boys were woken up just before dawn for cold baths and as much grueling physical labor as they could handle. It was definitely military training in a way that's sort of reminiscent of the training that the Spartans went through, but it was also this act of meriting your existence through physical hardship. Maybe that sounds familiar. Whenever you scroll Instagram and you see some 23-year-old posting about the 5 a.m. morning routine they do before they go to work, and they show themselves hopping into an ice bath and then deadlifting 400 pounds, this is Aztec ritual discipline. The whole goal is to harden the dense part of the body so that the light part, which is the soul, can shine brighter. There's also the obsession with clean, organic, non-GMO food. I think some of this got tied up in the Make America Healthy Again movement in 2024, but now it seems mostly to have transcended politics. The 2 worst things you can eat, according to Gen Z, are seed oils and any kind of processed food, which also includes seed oils. Basically, if your ancestors wouldn't have recognized it as food, you shouldn't put it in your body. The Aztecs had 2 superfoods that they saw as spiritual fuel, amaranth and cacao. I'm sure you're familiar with cacao, but if you haven't heard of amaranth, it's basically a type of grain that's harvested from these weed-like plants. It was considered to be so sacred that they would mix it with honey to form what were called god bodies, which they would eat in a ritual that could maybe in some ways be compared to Catholic communion. This all stemmed from the idea that certain foods directly fed the teolia, their name for what they considered to be the soul inside the heart. But what was the point of all of this? The ritual discipline, the sacred diet, the abstinence from alcohol. If you were an Aztec parent trying to raise your kids in the best way possible, your goal was to have them develop a face and a heart, in Ixiptlatl. A person without a face was anonymous, unstable, easily swayed. A person without a heart was cold and lacked movement. Here's where the Gen Z religious/spiritual revival ties it all together. It might be Christianity for some, for others it seems to be like manifesting or meditation or astrology or whatever else you can think of that takes you beyond yourself. It's an attempt to build a face the way the Aztecs did. In this insane, fast-paced, chaotic world where the lines between digital and physical are increasingly blurred, you kind of have to develop these ideals to create a stable, recognizable sense of self. So if these Aztec ideas were all about the self, then why did anybody have to get carved up on those big stone altars? The sacrifices were basically a public, ritualized way to remove impurity to save the collective. They say cancel culture doesn't exist anymore. I've talked about cancel culture in my videos, but I don't think Gen Z has really gotten the memo on this. They recently tried to cancel Timothée Chalamet for his completely valid comments on opera and ballet.
I don't want to be working in ballet or opera or, things where it's like, hey, keep this thing alive, even though no one cares about this anymore.
And then last week, they tried to cancel Sabrina Carpenter for the horrendous crime of not recognizing a very specific yodel from the crowd at her Coachella set.
Is that what you're doing? I don't like it.
It kind of does feel like this pressure valve releasing. Like, we're all pissed off and confused about what's going on domestically. We're pissed about these foreign conflicts that feel out of our control. So we drum up these fake controversies as public spectacles to almost purge the bad energy from the community. We have to sacrifice these celebrities on the altar of the algorithm. And then overall, if we can cast out the offender, because this isn't permanent, it's just temporary. It almost feels like just because of that, the universe has restored its purity in this weird way. I do think this is a slightly healthier social practice than cutting out someone's living heart, and it's not like this will really have a long-term effect on Timothy or Sabrina's careers, at least I don't think so, but it does somehow feel necessary and inevitable. Centuries after the Aztec Empire was scattered, we're still obsessed with our own form of bloodletting. But let's put the finishing touches on this Mexica masterpiece. I see so many people that are baffled by these Gen Z spiritual trends, like the authors of the articles I mentioned in the New York Times and the Washington Post. It's almost as if not only do they not understand why young people are doing this, but they also want it to stop. Go back to the reckless hedonism, they say. You're easier to control that way. But what they fail to recognize is that all of this is a product of the current environment and a perspective that is totally colored by the world that this generation has inherited. Just look at the Aztecs. When you have a whole group of people that feel like they're being left with a doomed world, it tends to affect the way they respond in their lives. But what do you think? Is Gen Z spirituality as messy as it seems on paper, or is there something more cohesive happening here? Sound off in the comments. As always, I'm John, this has been Medieval Mindset, and remember, the past isn't gone, it's simply waiting to be rediscovered.